To understand why your silence unsettled them so deeply, we first have to understand the emotional structure many avoidant individuals operate within. Avoidant psychology is not built on the absence of feelings. That's a common misunderstanding. In reality, many avoidant people feel deeply. The difference is that they manage those feelings through control. Control of distance, control of vulnerability, and control of the emotional rhythm of the relationship. Think about the dynamic that often forms between an avoidant and a more emotionally expressive partner. At the beginning, there is attraction, connection, sometimes even intense chemistry. But slowly, a pattern begins to develop. One person becomes the emotional initiator, the one who checks in, the one who asks where the relationship is going, the one who pushes for closeness. The avoidant partner, meanwhile, becomes the regulator of distance. They move closer when it feels safe, and they pull away when intimacy begins to feel overwhelming. Over time, this pattern becomes predictable, and predictability creates comfort, even if the relationship itself is unstable. The avoidant unconsciously begins to expect certain responses from you. They expect you to reach out after an argument. They expect you to explain yourself when something goes wrong. They expect you to keep the emotional engine of the relationship running. In other words, they expect pursuit. Not because they consciously want to manipulate you, but because pursuit reassures them that the connection still exists while allowing them to maintain their protective distance. As long as you keep moving toward them, they never have to fully confront their own vulnerability. And here is where the psychology becomes fascinating. When someone expects a particular emotional pattern long enough, it becomes part of their internal script. They begin to believe they understand how the relationship works. They know when tension will appear, when reconciliation will happen, and who will initiate it. The structure may be dysfunctional, but it is familiar. Human beings are remarkably attached to familiar emotional systems, even when those systems hurt them. For the avoidant, the familiar system often looks like this: distance followed by reassurance, withdrawal followed by pursuit, silence from them followed by effort from you. But this entire structure depends on one critical assumption: that you will continue playing your role. The moment you stop, the entire dynamic begins to destabilize. Because if the avoidant partner has spent months or even years expecting you to chase, to reach out, to repair the emotional distance they created, your silence does something they never anticipated. It removes the emotional safety net they didn't even realize they were relying on. Suddenly the pattern is broken, and when a pattern breaks, the mind searches for explanations. They begin to wonder what changed. They begin to question whether their assumptions about the relationship were accurate. The quiet space you create forces them to confront something they may have avoided for a long time: uncertainty. And uncertainty is something avoidant individuals work very hard to minimize in their emotional lives. Your silence introduces a kind of psychological disruption, not through confrontation, not through anger, but through absence. The emotional rhythm they expected is gone. The familiar cues are missing. And without those cues, the system they relied on no longer functions the same way. What makes this powerful is that silence is not aggressive. It is not dramatic. It does not demand anything, but precisely because it is calm and controlled, it cannot be easily dismissed. It simply changes the rules. And when the rules change, people are forced to reassess their role in the story. Because sometimes the most profound shift in a relationship doesn't come from what you say, it comes from what you stop doing. Now, once you understand that many avoidant dynamics run on a predictable emotional script, the next piece becomes easier to see. Because the moment you stop playing the role they expected you to play, something unusual happens inside their psychological world. Your silence doesn't just create distance, it disrupts the script they were unconsciously relying on. Human beings are pattern recognition machines. Our minds are constantly predicting what will happen next based on what has happened before. In relationships, this becomes even more powerful. Over time, couples fall into emotional rhythms. One person reacts in a certain way, the other responds in a predictable way, and the cycle repeats. With avoidant individuals, that rhythm often includes tension followed by pursuit. When conflict appears, they may withdraw. They become quiet, distant, or emotionally unavailable. But in their experience, the other person usually reacts by trying to close the gap. Messages appear, questions are asked, clarifications are offered. The emotional energy keeps flowing toward them. So even though they are the ones creating distance, they rarely feel the full weight of it. Why? Because someone else keeps bridging the space. And this becomes part of their psychological expectation. They don't consciously think they will chase me, but their nervous system becomes accustomed to the pattern. Distance is followed by reassurance. Withdrawal is followed by effort. Silence from them is followed by noise from you. But when you respond with silence of your own, something unfamiliar enters the system. Instead of the expected pursuit, there is stillness. Instead of emotional pressure, there is space. And the mind struggles when a long-standing pattern suddenly stops working. Imagine pressing a button that has always produced a response, and suddenly nothing happens. The first reaction is confusion. The second is curiosity. And sometimes the third is anxiety, because the brain is trying to understand what changed. Avoidant individuals often manage intimacy by controlling proximity. When closeness begins to feel overwhelming, they create distance. But that strategy only works smoothly when the other person moves toward them to rebalance the connection. Your silence removes that balancing force. Now, the distance they created doesn't behave the way it used to. It doesn't lead to reassurance. It doesn't lead to explanations. It doesn't lead to emotional negotiation. It simply exists, and that can be deeply disorienting. For the first time, the avoidant may feel the full presence of the space they created, not because you forced them to confront it, but because you stopped filling it. This is where the psychology becomes subtle but powerful. Silence is not confrontation. It is not accusation. It doesn't say, "You hurt me." It doesn't say, "You should feel guilty." It simply removes your participation from the old emotional dance. And when one partner stops dancing, the rhythm collapses. Now the avoidant mind begins asking questions it never needed to ask before. Why didn't they reach out? Did something change? Are they pulling away? Are they moving on? These questions arise not because you attacked them, but because you stepped outside the pattern they expected. And here's the deeper philosophical truth hidden inside this moment. People rarely examine a system that continues to work for them. Reflection often begins only when something interrupts the familiar flow of experience. Your silence becomes that interruption, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. It quietly forces a reassessment of assumptions, expectations, and emotional roles within the relationship. And sometimes the most powerful disruption in psychology isn't conflict at all. It's the calm, deliberate decision to stop reacting in the way someone predicted you would. And once that familiar pattern is broken, something else begins to happen, something far more internal. When the noise of the old dynamic disappears, silence starts to function like a mirror. Most relationships, especially those involving an avoidant dynamic, are filled with emotional movement. There are conversations, explanations, disagreements, moments of closeness, moments of distance. Even conflict itself can become a form of engagement. It keeps both people psychologically occupied. It keeps attention focused on the interaction rather than on deeper self-examination. But silence removes that movement. When you stop reaching out, stop reacting, stop filling the emotional space, the environment becomes very different. Suddenly, there is no ongoing dialogue to distract from the internal experience. There is just quiet. And quiet has a strange psychological power. It creates room for reflection. Avoidant individuals often spend a great deal of energy managing their emotional exposure. Distance is one of the tools they use to maintain stability. When things begin to feel too intense, they step back. They focus on work, on distractions, on independence. They redirect their attention outward. But when the familiar relational activity disappears, those distractions don't always carry the same effectiveness. Without new messages, without ongoing emotional exchanges, the mind eventually turns inward. Questions begin to appear, sometimes slowly, sometimes unexpectedly. What actually happened between us? Why did they stop responding the way they used to? Did I push them too far away? Was there more meaning in that connection than I allowed myself to see? These are not questions that arise easily during constant interaction. They require space. They require a pause in the usual emotional traffic. Silence creates that pause. And what makes this moment psychologically significant is that the reflection is not being forced by confrontation. When someone argues with us, our natural instinct is to defend ourselves. We justify our actions. We protect our identity. In many cases, we listen less and resist more. But silence doesn't trigger the same defensive response. There is no accusation to push against, no debate to win, no immediate pressure to respond. Instead, there is only the memory of what the relationship was and the awareness that something about it has changed. This is where the mirror effect begins to operate. When the external interaction fades, people are left with their own interpretation of events. They replay moments in their mind. They revisit conversations. They reconsider things they once dismissed quickly. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as delayed emotional processing. Certain individuals don't fully understand their feelings in the moment. The realization comes later, often when the situation has already shifted. Avoidant personalities are particularly familiar with this pattern. In the moment, distance feels safe. Independence feels stabilizing. But when time passes and the emotional environment grows quiet, the mind starts connecting dots that were previously ignored. And here is the deeper philosophical insight within all of this. Awareness often emerges not in the heat of interaction, but in the stillness that follows it. Your silence creates that stillness. It removes the emotional distractions that once allowed someone to avoid deeper reflection. It leaves behind a psychological space where memories, questions, and meaning can rise to the surface. Now, this doesn't guarantee transformation. Not everyone uses reflection to grow, but it does open a doorway that constant emotional engagement rarely allows, because when the conversation stops, the mind finally begins its own. And sometimes the most revealing mirror a person can face is the quiet left behind when someone they took for granted simply steps out of the noise. Once that period of reflection begins to emerge, another subtle but powerful shift starts taking place in the relationship dynamic itself. And this shift has to do with something we don't often talk about openly, but it is present in almost every human connection: the balance of emotional power. Now, when we hear the word power, we sometimes imagine manipulation or dominance. But in relationships, power is usually much quieter than that. It simply refers to who controls the direction of emotional movement, who decides when there is closeness, when there is distance, and when the connection is repaired. In many avoidant relationships, that balance slowly tilts in a particular direction. The avoidant partner becomes the one who regulates proximity. They determine when to pull back, when to re-engage, and how much vulnerability enters the space. Meanwhile, the other partner often becomes the stabilizer, the one who maintains emotional continuity by reaching out, repairing tension, or reestablishing connection after periods of distance. Over time, this creates an invisible structure. One person moves away, the other moves closer. One person becomes quiet, the other tries to reopen the conversation. This dynamic isn't usually designed intentionally. It develops gradually, shaped by personality, attachment style, and emotional habits. But once the pattern is established, it can feel almost automatic. Both individuals begin to operate within it without consciously realizing it. And here is where your silence becomes transformative. When you stop chasing the connection, when you stop rushing to repair every emotional gap, the balance of movement changes. The person who once controlled distance suddenly encounters a situation where distance exists without their control. That can feel deeply unfamiliar. For the avoidant individual, emotional autonomy has often been their sense of security. They feel safe when they know they can step back whenever things become too intense. But when the other person also steps back, calmly, quietly, without drama, the system they relied on begins to shift. Now there is a new question in the air. Who is actually directing the emotional direction of this relationship? Because when both people create space, the old pattern no longer functions. This can create a surprising psychological reaction. The avoidant partner may begin to feel something they rarely experienced before: the possibility of losing influence over the emotional outcome. Not control in a manipulative sense, but control in the sense of predictability. Predictability is one of the mind's favorite comforts. When we believe we understand how someone will behave, we feel stable. But when that predictability disappears, our attention sharpens. We start paying closer attention. We start reevaluating the situation. And this is where the power dynamic subtly rebalances. Your silence communicates something without saying a word. It communicates that your emotional energy is no longer automatically available to maintain the old structure. It communicates that you are capable of stepping outside the pattern that once defined the relationship. That realization can shift perception dramatically, because when someone recognizes that you are no longer anchored to the role they expected you to play, they begin to see you differently. You are no longer simply the person who absorbs distance and repairs it. You become someone with agency, boundaries, and independence. And paradoxically, independence often generates more respect than pursuit ever could. This doesn't mean the goal is to gain power over someone else. That mindset only creates a new, unhealthy pattern. The deeper transformation is internal. It's the moment when you stop structuring your emotional life around someone else's comfort with distance. When you do that, the relationship, if it continues, must evolve into something more balanced. Because true connection cannot exist where only one person carries the responsibility for closeness. Real relationships begin when both people are equally capable of stepping forward. And sometimes the first step toward that balance is the quiet moment when you decide you are no longer the one responsible for chasing the connection. Once that balance begins to shift, something else quietly enters the emotional landscape, something many people don't expect: curiosity, and sometimes alongside it, a subtle form of anxiety. Now, this might seem surprising at first. After all, avoidant individuals are known for creating distance. They often appear comfortable with space. They may even insist that they need independence, time alone, or emotional breathing room. So when distance finally appears, you might assume they would simply accept it without much thought. But human psychology rarely works that simply. Distance feels safe when it is chosen. It feels very different when it is imposed by circumstance, or when someone else creates it first. For a long time in the relationship dynamic, the avoidant partner likely experienced distance as something they controlled. They stepped back when emotions became intense. They created pauses when vulnerability started to rise. And because the other person usually responded by moving closer, that distance never fully threatened the connection. In other words, the space they created still existed within a predictable system. But when your silence enters the picture, the nature of that space changes. Now, the distance is not simply something they initiated. It becomes something they must interpret, and interpretation activates the mind. The brain begins to search for explanations. Why did they suddenly stop reaching out? Why isn't the conversation continuing the way it used to? Did something happen that I'm unaware of? Are they losing interest? Have they emotionally moved on? These questions introduce uncertainty, and uncertainty naturally triggers curiosity. Curiosity is one of the mind's most powerful motivational forces. When we encounter something we don't fully understand, our attention gravitates toward it. We start replaying memories, analyzing conversations, and examining subtle details we previously overlooked. And for avoidant individuals, this curiosity can be particularly intriguing because it often emerges from a position they're not accustomed to occupying. Instead of being the one who withdraws and waits for pursuit, they find themselves observing a silence they didn't initiate. They may begin checking their phone more often than usual. They may think about the relationship during moments when they once easily distracted themselves. This doesn't necessarily mean panic, but it can create a quiet, psychological tension because the story they were telling themselves about the relationship suddenly lacks new information. The familiar signals are gone. And when information disappears, the mind fills the gap with speculation. Sometimes that speculation leads to concern. Did I push them too far? Sometimes it leads to curiosity. What changed in them? And sometimes it leads to a deeper realization. Maybe they weren't as dependent on this connection as I assumed. What's important to understand here is that your silence introduces a form of emotional unpredictability. Not chaos, not drama, just unpredictability. And unpredictability captures attention. Think about how the human mind responds to mystery. When everything is explained, our interest fades quickly. But when something remains unresolved, our thoughts return to it again and again. We want to understand the missing piece. In the context of relationships, silence can create exactly that kind of unresolved space. The avoidant individual may begin to see the connection through a slightly different lens. The person who once felt consistently available now appears more autonomous, more self-directed, less defined by the relationship dynamic. And that shift can awaken something that wasn't fully active before. The realization that the connection is not guaranteed. Not because you threatened them, not because you tried to provoke a reaction, but because you stepped back from a pattern that once made the relationship feel predictable. And when predictability disappears, awareness often takes its place. Because sometimes curiosity begins the moment someone realizes that the person they thought would always remain within reach has quietly stepped beyond the edge of expectation. And when all of these shifts begin to unfold, the broken pattern, the quiet reflection, the rebalancing of emotional power, the curiosity that rises in the absence of certainty, we arrive at the deeper lesson hidden beneath the silence. Because ultimately, silence is not really about them at all. It's about you reclaiming something that may have slowly slipped away in the dynamic, your emotional boundaries. Many people misunderstand silence in relationships. They think of it as a tactic, a form of manipulation, or a strategy designed to provoke a reaction. But when it is used with clarity and self-respect, silence is something very different. It is not an attempt to control another person's behavior. It is a decision to stop participating in a pattern that no longer honors your emotional well-being. In many avoidant dynamics, the emotionally expressive partner gradually takes on more and more responsibility for maintaining the connection. They become the one who explains, who reassures, who initiates the difficult conversations. When tension appears, they try to repair it. When distance appears, they try to close it. At first, this effort often comes from a sincere place. It's driven by care, by hope, by the belief that communication will eventually bring the relationship into balance. But over time, something subtle can happen. The effort becomes one-sided, and when emotional responsibility becomes one-sided, exhaustion eventually follows. Not just physical exhaustion, but emotional exhaustion. The feeling that you are carrying the entire weight of connection while the other person remains comfortably distant from it. This is where boundaries become essential. A boundary is not a punishment. It is not a wall designed to hurt someone else. A boundary is simply a clear statement of what you will and will not continue to participate in. It is a recognition that your emotional energy is valuable and that it deserves to exist in a relationship where it is reciprocated. Silence, when it comes from this place, becomes an expression of self-respect. It says without accusation, I will no longer chase connection where mutual effort is missing. It says without anger, my emotional life cannot revolve entirely around someone else's comfort with distance. And perhaps most importantly, it says, I trust myself enough to step away from a pattern that diminishes my sense of balance. This shift is powerful, not because it forces another person to change, but because it changes the way you relate to yourself. You stop measuring your worth by how quickly someone responds. You stop interpreting distance as something you must immediately fix. You stop believing that love requires constant pursuit. Instead, you begin to understand something deeper about healthy connection. True relationships do not survive because one person continuously closes every gap. They survive because both people are willing to step forward when space appears. Both people are willing to communicate. Both people are willing to invest emotional presence. And if that mutual movement does not exist, silence becomes a form of clarity. It allows you to observe what happens when you stop carrying the entire emotional structure alone. Sometimes the other person steps forward, sometimes they don't. But either outcome reveals the truth of the dynamic far more clearly than endless effort ever could. Because silence removes the illusion that effort alone can sustain a relationship. It reminds you that connection must be shared, not maintained by one person's persistence. And in that realization, something important happens internally. You begin to shift your focus away from trying to manage someone else's emotional distance and back towards something far more meaningful, your own emotional integrity. You start building a life where your presence, your energy, and your care are offered freely, but never at the cost of your self-respect. And that is the quiet power behind the silence, because in the end, the most important message your silence can ever communicate is not directed at them. It is the moment you finally show yourself that your peace is worth protecting. As we step back and look at everything we've explored today, a deeper picture begins to emerge. What initially looked like something small, something as simple as silence, actually reveals a powerful psychological shift, because your silence was never part of their plan. The dynamic they were used to depended on something very specific. It depended on your pursuit, your explanations, your willingness to close every emotional gap the moment it appeared. That pattern created predictability, and predictability created comfort, even if the relationship itself was unbalanced. But the moment you stepped outside that pattern, everything changed. The script they were used to no longer worked. The familiar rhythm of distance followed by pursuit disappeared. And in its place came something they rarely had to face before: uncertainty, reflection, curiosity, and the realization that the emotional structure of the relationship was never as stable as it seemed. And here's the deeper truth: silence doesn't force someone to care. It doesn't magically transform another person's psychology. What it does is far more important. It reveals reality. It reveals whether someone steps forward when you stop chasing. It reveals whether curiosity turns into effort or whether distance simply becomes permanent. It reveals whether the connection was mutual or whether it survived only because you kept carrying it forward. That clarity can feel uncomfortable at first. When we stop trying to control the outcome, we have to face the possibility that the outcome may not be what we hope for. But clarity is also freedom, because once you stop performing the role that kept the old dynamic alive, you begin to reclaim something far more valuable than someone else's attention. You reclaim your emotional autonomy. You begin to understand that real connection does not grow from constant pursuit. It grows from mutual presence. It grows when two people are equally willing to move toward each other, not when one person spends their energy closing every gap alone. And when you reach that understanding, something powerful happens inside you. Your silence stops being about strategy. It stops being about provoking a reaction. Instead, it becomes a reflection of something deeper, self-respect. It becomes the quiet decision to no longer invest your emotional energy in a pattern that requires you to abandon your own balance. Because the truth is, the strongest position you can ever stand in within a relationship is not the one where you chase harder, explain better, or prove your worth more convincingly. The strongest position is the one where you understand your value so clearly that you no longer need to convince anyone to meet you halfway. And when you reach that place, silence is no longer empty. It becomes a statement that your presence is meaningful, but your peace is not negotiable.